This is Michael Bell with the CVB Challenge. Once again, learning a Christ verse from each of the 66 books of the Bible. And we're in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. Now, this is a very interesting verse indeed. And with this verse, we finish out the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Moses says to expect the Messiah, this is a messianic text quoted by Peter in the book of Acts, to expect a prophet like him. And so it's very interesting to see all the parallels between Jesus and Moses. We start with Moses' birth. He is born, and immediately a king is trying to kill him, and that would be Pharaoh. This parallels Jesus' own birth, who, as soon as he's born, Herod is trying to kill him, and he flees of all places, to Egypt. It's as if the dragon is trying to devour the offspring of the woman as she gives birth. Later on, we go into Moses' life, and we see that after 40 years of being raised in a royal family, he gives up his royal privilege as the Pharaoh's own household to identify with a slave people in order to free them from their slavery. And this is parallel to what Jesus has done. Jesus is the member of the Trinity, the second member of the Trinity, equal with God in every respect. John chapter 1 and other passages. And then in Philippians chapter 2, we see that he gives up his royal privileges, his divine privileges, in order to become a true human being and identify with a slave people. Who are you and me, slaves to sin? Continuing on with Moses' life, we see that he spends 40 years in the desert in preparation for his ministry. Jesus also spent 40 days in the desert, being tempted by Satan, being prepared for ministry. Moses comes back and pronounces his goal of liberating the children of Israel from the hand of Pharaoh, and he's immediately rejected by his own people. Not only then, but subsequently, time after time after time. And even after the Exodus, when he succeeded in liberating them and they're traveling through the desert, he's rejected over and over and over and over and over again. Finally, at Kadesh Barnea, they say, let's elect a new leader and go back to Egypt. Well, this is the case with Jesus. The Bible says that he came to his own people, but his own people rejected him. Going on, we see that Moses, with the hand of God, he brought many plagues to Egypt, great catastrophes that devastated the land of Egypt. And we wonder, well, when did this ever happen with Jesus? Those weren't the kind of miracles that Jesus performed. He didn't bring plagues and hailstorms and darkness and devastating things to ruin the land and so on. So is this an exception? Well, it's not an exception. To the contrary, this announces the kind of Jesus that the kind of thing that will announce his second coming. This isn't Jesus in the first coming, rather it's Jesus in the second coming. If we read the book of Revelation, we find not only the devastation of one nation, as in the case of Egypt, with sort of a limited geography, but these incredibly devastating judgments upon all the nations. The entire world is devastated by the judgments associated with Jesus coming. We go on. Moses gives them the Passover. Jesus is the fulfillment of that Passover. Moses gives them manna from heaven. Jesus is the bread from heaven. Moses gives them water from a rock. Jesus is the rock cleft for you and me, and out of him flow living waters. Moses is the great lawgiver. Jesus descends, on the Sermon on the Mount, he shows himself to be a greater lawgiver. Moses had said, don't commit adultery in the flesh. Jesus says, don't even do it in the mind, raising the bar. Moses had said, well, you need to keep your word when you give an oath. And Jesus says, no, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Always keep your word, even when you're not swearing under oath. Moses says, You must love your neighbor. And Jesus says, yes, love your neighbor, but I'm telling you to love your enemy. So he's this lawgiver with a greater law even than what Moses had. We see Moses as a judge. Jesus comes not to judge one nation as Moses did, but to be the judge of judges and judge all nations. He was a prophet. Jesus comes as the greatest prophet of all. On and on, we see that everything that Moses did, Jesus did, only better or to a greater degree. It's as if Moses leaves this giant footprint in the sand and Jesus comes with an even bigger foot and makes a larger impression, fulfilling everything that Moses did, only to a much greater degree and only much better. So he out-Moses Moses. He's more of a Moses than Moses is himself. Now, the only exception here is we see that on one occasion, Moses lost his temper and disgraced God in front of the people. And God said, Moses, you will not be allowed to bring the people in. You were the great liberator who brought them out of Egypt, but you will not be able to take them into the promised land. Jesus did not fail in that way. He is not only the one who frees us from Egypt, successfully takes us through the great pilgrimage of our discipleship through the desert, but he's also the one who's able to introduce us into the promised land. That is to say, he's able to bring us into God's presence and into the inheritance God has for his people through Jesus Christ. Now, if Jesus is on every page of the Bible, shouldn't he also be on every page of your life and mine?